The last quarter of the 20th century and the first decade of our own has seen a remarkable resurgence of pre-modern ideas. Many contemporary philosophers have made an effort to look back again to a kind of pre-modern past in order to find inspiration and, in some instances, correction in their own philosophies, and indeed, especially in those philosophies that concern human destiny and the notion of the ethical life. So I want to consider one of these attempts in particular and the sort of movement that it spawned. I want to set the stage by going back to some of the material that we covered in Unit 1. Now, remember in Unit 1 in this course, I differentiated between two different ways of viewing ethics, what ethics as a discipline is. To us, to our modern ears, I think we tend to think of ethics as designating a system of sort of rules, right? Moral principles, do's and don'ts, and the like. And I contrasted that with a more ancient and medieval way of looking at ethics, according to which ethics was the pursuit of the good life, right? When you were doing ethics, quote unquote, you weren't simply trying to provide a list of rules of conduct or a set of principles by which you could evaluate the moral rightness or wrongness of actions. You were trying to answer the question, what is a good life? What is it to live a happy life, and how can I do that, right? You'll remember as well that there was a rather stable methodology that was used in pursuit of an answer to this question. Remember, you went first to the question of human nature to answer the question of the ethical or the good life. The reason, of course, was that in order to know what it is to be a good human being, you've got to know what it is to be a human being, what human nature is. And only then can you push forward and answer the question concerning the purpose of individuals, how well an individual can fulfill their own purpose as a human being. And that was sort of coextensive with the same thing as them being a happy or flourishing individual. Well, we've seen in our fourth and fifth units, more and more pressure, more and more scrutiny and skepticism being directed towards the idea that there is such a thing as a stable, universal human nature, and that there could be such a thing as transcendent meaning or purpose or human destiny in that strong, robust sense. So, we see a great divergence between pre-modern ways of thinking about the human individual and human destiny and postmodern contemporary ways of thinking about human destiny and the human individual. How did we get here? What explains this sort of sea change in the way that we tend to view things? Well, one very impressive answer to this question comes to us in the form of a book written by MacIntyre in the 80s, published in the 80s, a book called After Virtue. And in this book, MacIntyre begins by giving us a sort of very memorable thought experiment or analogy. And what he says is this. He asks us to imagine the following scenario. He says, suppose that some catastrophe occurred. Suppose that a political group came into power, and this political group was anti-scientific, was hell-bent on destroying all scientific knowledge, stopping scientists from pursuing their work by exiling them, executing them, or whatever, and was bent again on purging from the minds of its citizen whatever accumulated scientific understanding and wisdom that they had. And suppose that over a course of a couple of generations, they fairly well succeeded in this task. Scientific books have been burnt, articles have been destroyed, scientific learning has been disrupted, no longer to be passed down, and practicing scientists have been persecuted and exiled and so forth. Okay, now suppose, step 2 in the thought experiment, that After this political group is relieved of their power, and a new political group comes in and does its level best to restore the accumulated scientific wisdom that had been lost. So you see a gathering up of what remains of scientific literature, charred, partial books, scraps and fragments from scientific articles, and so on and so forth. Groups come together trying to sort of reconstruct, put all of these records back together and learn from them. They end up picking up quite a bit of scientific terminology. They end up knowing the names and perhaps in broad outline what some of the scientific theories were supposed to have been about. And you can imagine different groups of these societies or these groups coming together to debate the merits, the relative merits, say, of classical Newtonian mechanics versus quantum mechanics, relativity theory, or whatever it is. Now, the outside educated onlooker, MacIntyre says, is going to be able to view the debates of these people and see that their debates, their manner of argumentation, and their discourse betray a complete ignorance of the scientific theories that they're presumably arguing about, because they no longer have knowledge of the intellectual historical culture within which these scientific theories were formulated. And the scientific terms that they're using have become unmoored, unanchored to the culture in which they actually acquired their meaning. Okay, now MacIntyre says that our own situation, the state of moral discourse now, or at any rate at the time that he wrote the book, is like the state of physical scientific discourse in the imagined thought experiment. He thinks that we have actually historically gone through a sort of moral catastrophe, which has led to us still using a whole wealth of moral discourse, moral vocabulary. We see no end to ethical and moral arguments and debates, but the sort of knowledgeable onlooker from the outside would look at us and make the same evaluation, think the same thing, that we really don't understand the meaning of the terms that we're deploying in our debates, that we really don't quite grasp the theoretical use of them and the sort of moral theories that we're attempting either to support or to debunk. And this is because the inheritance of this moral discourse and these moral concepts is fragmentary. It's bequeathed to us only after we've sort of rejected wholesale the intellectual, historical, cultural framework within which it had its meaning. And we don't recognize this about ourselves, and so we don't recognize that we are speaking in ways that betray our own fundamental ignorance and that help to explain the interminable and shrill nature of our own moral argumentation. So how did this happen? Well, MacIntyre locates the sort of onset of this moral catastrophe, or catastrophe with respect to our moral knowledge, as being within the Enlightenment period, and in particular in the fallout afterward, the Enlightenment period, after the failure of what he calls the Enlightenment project. So remember, going back to the modern period, here is a time where we decide we're going to cut the apron strings, we're going to put at arm's length the authorities and the traditions of yesteryear, start over again, start over too with a new set of presuppositions concerning individual autonomy and the like, sort of rewriting from the ground up the story of human nature and retelling to ourselves stories concerning human destiny. We end up in this period eschewing these old Aristotelian notions that there is a kind of transcendent teleology or purpose to everything in the world, to nature itself, and therefore in specific to the human individual. For Aristotle, there is an answer to the question, what is the function of a human? Just as there's an answer to the question, what is the function of a knife or an artifact? And just as we can say, given the description of what a knife is, what that knife is supposed to be, what it takes to be a good knife, we can say what a human being is, what it takes to be a good human being, and so forth. So there really isn't a sort of huge dichotomy between fact and value or moral evaluation on Aristotle's scheme, precisely because of this idea of human nature and of human purpose or teleology. Add that together with the notion that there is some sort of divine being or divine order to the world, which is expressed in this human nature and which is behind its ordering, then you have quite a stable sort of metaphysical groundwork for the moral claims you might make and the ethical life that you might conceive, right? In, again, this broader sense of seeing ethics as an attempt to live a good and flourishing life, given my objective purpose and meaning in this world. Okay, well, we hit the modern period, and again, we decide to eschew Aristotle, the notion of human essences, teleology, purpose, and more, if not the existence of God, the arguments for the existence of God certainly came under more and more critical scrutiny, so that it was harder to rely upon notions about divine command or divine orders in the world in order to provide a proper foundation, sort of recognizably respectable, universally respectable foundation for human ethics. So what are you going to do? Well, we're talking about human ethics, and we're talking about questions concerning human destiny and the purpose of life, and all of the ways in which these questions impact political and social formation. So you can't simply leave it up in the air or leave it for another day. You've got to find a different foundation, a different way of answering these questions if the sort of age-old pre-modern ways of answering them could no longer be relied upon. And that's in fact what you see in the so-called Enlightenment project. So for example, Immanuel Kant comes around reacting to Hume's suggestion that reason doesn't need to ground sort of moral decision-making or judgments. Really, morality is grounded in the passions and in particular in the emotion of sympathy. And in Hume's sort of complacent, Scottish Presbyterian outlook, it doesn't sound very dangerous to let human feeling and sentiment take over with respect to moral decision making. Kant thinks, on the contrary, that because of the inherent subjectivity of human emotions and so forth, and also in particular because of the fact that a genuinely morally worthy action can't be done simply out of emotion or feeling, but has to be done out of reason's recognition of duty. Because of this, he says, no, we have got to find a foundation, a groundwork for morals that is firmly established in reason and shown to be necessary, categorical, sort of unanswerably necessary and certain. And to this end, he creates his own moral theory, which is supposed to be grounded in reason, given these tests of universalizability and so forth that we covered already. Here too, though, MacIntyre points out that this project failed, and it has to fail. Not only does Kant's universalizability test fail time and time again, but Kant's attempt to ground human ethics and questions concerning the good life in a way that was abstracted from human nature and grounded in something like an abstract necessary reason or rationality, MacIntyre thinks was doomed to fail. So we move on and we see Kierkegaard make further attempts. Nietzsche looks square in the face the fact that, we can't answer by reason why human beings should behave according to the dictates of this older morality, and reason itself can't tell us what sort of new morality might be created in its place. Rather, there is only the will to power and the will towards what Nietzsche is impressed with, namely a kind of older, aristocratic, heroic age in which the virtues of, power and self-assertion are in the ascendancy. Well, it's a very long story, but at the end of the day, MacIntyre says this Enlightenment attempt to find a different foundation to the question of the good life, to the purpose and destiny of the human individual, has failed. And its failure is exhibited especially in some of the movements concerning the meaning of moral language that we see in the 20th century. So MacIntyre focuses on Emotivism and Expressivism as a theory of, again, the linguistic meaning of moral utterances. According to these expressivists, when you make a moral claim, when you say such and thus is good or bad, right or wrong, ought or ought not to be done, you aren't asserting anything factual because there's an unbridgeable gap between is and ought, an unbridgeable gap between fact and value, and no amount of logic or metaphysics or anything else can bridge that gap for you. So if I say something is good, that's really in meaning equivalent to saying, I like this, do so too. If I say that something is bad, ought not to be done, that's equivalent to saying, boo on that, I don't like that, you shouldn't either, or join me in not liking that. These are empty of factual content. They are simply expressions of our own emotional reactions to various things and invitations for others to react to those things in the same way. Now, of course, folks outside of the ivory tower and those who don't pay attention to these academic debates about meanings will be quick to say that's not how they think of themselves as using moral language. They do, we do, think we're saying things that are factual. We continue to debate. We continue to argue. And we think others should think that we're doing and saying more than merely expressing our own opinions. How can we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? Given the story about how we landed ourselves in this situation where we're using fragments of moral language that no longer mean what they used to, where we're debating theories without any clear sense about how the debates might objectively, in reason, be resolved, and so forth. How can we push forward in a salutary way? Well, MacIntyre and those following him does not suggest that we can simply return to the past, sort of rewind and reboot as if the modern period and the postmodern period never happened. He does counsel, however, that given that we have landed ourselves in an unstable and unmanageable situation on matters of grave concern, that we ought to go back to this pre-modern period and see whether we might not have made a mistake in eschewing some elements of the classical tradition, of the ancient and medieval synthesis that enabled them to make more sense than we perhaps can now of the meaning and purpose and destiny of the human person. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot of work going on right now. And who's to say, what kind of prognostication can I make concerning what the end result of these studies and these debates, these attempts to go back and glean something from the past, synthesize it with what we know now, where all of that is ultimately going to go? I don't know. Again, it's anyone's guess. What I do think is true, and what I do think we can definitely take over from the ancient or classical tradition concerning human nature, is that we can't stop asking these questions. Despite the frustration and, it seems, the inevitability of conflict and the irresolvability of some of these questions, its apparent irresolvability. In any case, we can't quit on it. To do so would be less than human. We do, as Aristotle pointed out, by our nature. We want to know. We need to know. We're driven to know. And so, I'm drawn in closing to think of what Theaetetus says to Socrates in a very similar connection. He tells Socrates, dang it, in a fit of frustration, he says, I can't say anything that's ever going to satisfy you, Socrates. And because of that, I can't say anything that's actually going to satisfy myself, but I can't stop thinking of it. I can't stop trying. And so what Theaetetus says to Socrates there with respect to human nature is what I think we all must say to Socrates, personifying philosophy, with respect to the question of human destiny. It is not a question that we can simply let go of and maintain any stable, unifying, plausible conception of what it is and what it means to be human.